Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online adaptation communities of practice. And those are run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 35 to 40 minutes. And then at the end of the webinar, we're going to have some time left for any questions that you might have for Sheri. So if you have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. So before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted. And this is just to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. So to ask a question during the Q&A session, all you're going to have to do is dial *6 and that will unmute your line. But please do keep your lines muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there is a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. So you can use this chat area to field any questions that you might have for Sheri during the Q&A. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can also use this area to type out your message, or you can actually click on my name and send me a private message, and I can try to help you out as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, so I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to everyone who pre-registered with me, and I'll also be posting it to the FACoP website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACoP, is. So I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community. It's dedicated to those who are working in forestry or who are simply interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. So it includes features such as online news, articles, discussion forums, upcoming events, a library of resources, and much more. So it's free to join. If there's anybody on the line who's interested in learning more about the FACoP, there's a link to the site in the chat box there. So with that being said, we're very excited to have Sheri Andrews-Key on the line with us today to talk about vulnerability and adaptation to climate change and sustainable forest management and forest industry in Saskatchewan. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Sheri has lived from coast to coast in Canada, working in various facets of the forest environment for over 25 years, including industry, government, and academia. So she holds a number of degrees from the University of Saskatchewan, including bachelor degrees in both land use and environmental studies and physical geography, a master's degree in geography focusing on sustainable forest management and climate change within the prairie provinces, and a Bachelor of Education degree in secondary science. She's currently completing her PhD in Adaptation, Sustainable Forest Management, Policy, and Climate Change within the Boreal Forest at the University of Saskatchewan in the School of Environment and Sustainability. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Sheri, for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. We really appreciate it. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Annette, for that great introduction. And thanks for everybody joining us today. So we'll just get right into this. I'm looking at adapting forest policy and practices in Saskatchewan to climate change. So we all know that climate change is having an effect on the boreal forest, that this ecosystem is being affected within the disturbance regime and coming under stresses with climate-related impacts. And in Saskatchewan forests, we're looking at what is this going to mean for our sustainable forest management practices? So we're also taking the direction from the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers and their recommendations on including climate change and the impact in management practices, and looking at mainstreaming adaptation and monitoring into the decision-making for forest practitioners. So there's a guidebook that has come out from the CCFM, and it looks at assessing the vulnerability and provides some tools for being able to do this for both practitioners and policymakers. So policy, we're looking at one of the questions that has come out of a lot of the research and the information that's out there. For Saskatchewan, what does a changing climate and its impacts on our forests look like? And with relation to policy and the management practices, how do we evolve to deal with this in the face of an uncertain climate? Now, Saskatchewan Forest Service branch has come to recognize that this needs to be a priority for them. They need to address this. And in December of 2014, they held a workshop that involved many different partners from other government agencies, policy people, stakeholders within different facets of the forest sector, representatives from industry, and researchers. And at this workshop, they looked at and discussed climate change impacts, potential climate change scenarios, and what this would look like for Saskatchewan in the face of management and policy. And what they came up with is, yes, we need to make this a priority. We need to address this. But how? Where do we go from here? So they wanted to put policymakers and practitioners in a better position to manage Saskatchewan's forests for the future. But again, how do they do that? That was one of the big questions. And they identified that they felt that there was a gap between the policy and the practices with relation to climate change impacts, and a future of uncertainty. And that's where Dr. Mark Johnson from Saskatchewan Research and I came together on, the information that had come out of this workshop, and had discussions with Saskatchewan Environment on a project that would look at examining Saskatchewan's forest policy and management options that would involve both the government and industry to look at a new direction or some new development to policy and adaptation options for forest practitioners that would relate to climate change. And then ultimately look at developing some guidelines, some tools that could actually be applied and used on the ground. So through this project, what we thought we should look at would be, where are things most vulnerable in terms of sustainable forest management? What type of adaptations are possible on the ground? And how does policy fit into this? How can policy help with this? Where are potential even adaptations or changes in policy required to allow for adaptation? So the idea is that this research will help policymakers and practitioners increase their adaptive capacity to help meet sustainable forest management objectives within Saskatchewan forestry. So we feel that there's some real innovation here with making these linkages from the science to the applied management, then translating that into policy and helping making policy perhaps more flexible in being able to mainstream adaptation options into sustainable forest management practices. And with these linkages that we're identifying, there's going to be adaptation tools that will allow for a more forward-looking management instead of a more reactive in the face of an uncertain forest climate. So what we discussed, and the general consensus was that, if we don't recognize or acknowledge this and really start to make this a priority, the result of the widespread impacts that we could face could be catastrophic, or we could look at either avoiding some of these impacts or minimizing them if we move towards having more appropriate or flexible policy that will aid in adaptation strategies and putting tools in place that can be utilized to address vulnerabilities and climate change impacts on our forests. So in this project, it's kind of broken down into three main components. And the first component of this study includes a case study with Mystic Management Limited. So for those of you who aren't aware, I will discuss a little more in depth who Mystic is. But they're a Saskatchewan-based forest company. They are in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. And when the idea of this project really started to unfold, through discussions with Forest Services branch here, we approached Mystic with the idea of doing the case study with them for this project. And they were really excited about collaborating with the government and moving in a direction that would provide some more tools, something concrete, taking that next step. So they were willing to be part of this project. And then after the case study, what we're moving towards is the development of guidelines for climate change with relation to forest policy in Saskatchewan. And we will be following the results-based management approach for this. And then ultimately, what we're going to come out with is a guidebook for Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment that will deal specifically with climate change adaptation for both policymakers and practitioners. And we're going to be utilizing the CCFM framework for vulnerability and adaptation for the foundation for this guidebook. So really where we are in this project is we're 3/4 of the way through our case study. And this has been a really exciting process. So Mystic Management Limited, it's a woodlands management company, and they provide timber and forest services to their owners, which are North Sask Forest Products and Meadow Lake Mechanical Pulp. Now, all three of these groups are housed in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. And since 1998, Mystic has been the licensee of the forest management area in the northern, north central, and northwestern part of Saskatchewan. Now, this is just a general map of Saskatchewan, but I'll use the pointer here. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Saskatchewan, this right here is Meadow Lake. So this is where Mystic is housed out of. And then their forest management area goes up to the north and to the northwest part of the province. And they have approximately 1.9 million hectares in their forest management area. So in this case study, what we wanted to do was a vulnerability assessment that would look at both the current and future risks of climate change to Mystic's sustainable forest management system, which includes their forest management area. And we decided to use the CCFM guidebook that I referred to earlier as our tool to do this vulnerability assessment. And through it, we are including both the biophysical impacts of climate change and aspects of Mystic's land base, and also the management, the FFM part of their practices and relating it to climate change. So we're also looking at, in this vulnerability assessment, how Mystic has responded to the past and is responding to present, and then looking at future climate-related impacts. So by doing this, it's going to allow us to look at Mystic's capability in in terms of adapting with climate, so their adaptive capacity. How well are they set up to adapt under current and future scenarios to potential impacts of climate change? We're also, through this process, working with Mystic on mainstreaming this climate change monitoring and adaptation into their annual operating plans and their 20-year forest management plan. So that's really exciting for them because we're realizing this is going to be a tool that will allow them to just be better prepared for the future when addressing these issues. And it will allow for the integration of these options into their everyday planning and practices as well. So this diagram here on slide 15, we're looking at a vulnerability assessment. And this is, basically what the CCFM guidebook is based on. And you start off with your decision to actually do this. Why are we doing this vulnerability assessment? And then you're moving into the climate piece and you're looking at, okay, what is the relationship of our current SFM system with regards to current climate? How are we being affected now? And then you move into, given climate scenarios for the future under different time horizons, how are we going to be potentially impacted? What is our vulnerability level in the future? So then we're moving into assessing future vulnerability of our SFM system to climate change. Then from there, once you get an idea of what you're dealing with on your land base and in your system, moving into adaptation options. Then asking, is residual SFM vulnerability acceptable? Either yes or no. Yes, if it is, we're going to monitor this and keep revisiting this. Or no, we need to modify adaptation. Or maybe we need to go back and look at our SFM objectives and reassess what our vulnerability is, and maybe assign different priorities as well. So this is the vulnerability assessment in a nutshell. So the CCFM vulnerability assessment that we have been using has 4 phases. Phase 1 includes their organizational readiness, like, can we complete this? Are we ready to commit to this process? And phase 2, you're looking at a pre-vulnerability analysis. So you're gathering different types of information on your SFM system that is then going to help lead into phase 3, which is your detailed vulnerability analysis. Then from there, you move into the last phase, phase 4, to identify, implement, and monitor adaptation. So this is the mainstreaming portion of the case study and the vulnerability assessment. So far, we have just completed up to phase 3 of this vulnerability assessment. So we're just moving into phase 4 here. So we're at a pretty exciting portion. And what the CCFM guidebook does for assessing vulnerability, it walks you through this process step by step. So it's we're finding it to be a really useful tool from an industry perspective. So the case study process, one of the things that we thought the team, the Mystic employees that are part of this case study, and myself and some other people that have been involved in this, Jason Edwards from Canadian Forest Service and Mark Johnson from SRC, we felt that it was really important to talk to people about the process of this, because this is new and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So a lot of questions that we have gotten is, how do we start this? Where do we, even though it tells you this is where you start, it can be overwhelming. So in the beginning, you have to have, I guess, full engagement of the company. So your organizational readiness, and this is phase one. Do we have the ability to do this? Is the timing right for our organization to do this? Do we have the resources available? And resources aren't just like, we're not referring to just monetary. Do we have the people committed to doing this as well? And then in phase two, once you decide, yes, we are ready, we're prepared to go ahead and do this, you need that company and stakeholder commitment to really make this a successful venture. Then you move into the assessing the vulnerability to climate change. Okay, so we've decided we can do this. We've got the commitment from the company. Now, what are our needs with relation to assessing climate vulnerability, and what goals do we want to have coming out of this process? Then, so how do you get started on doing all this? Well, you have to define your problem or your challenge for your specific SFM system. And everybody's system is different because each organization has a different mandate. So Mystic has its mandate set out for them by their owners, and also by the regulations that they have to follow with what they do on the land base from the provincial government. So that really helps them define, their problem or their challenge with respect to climate change and their system. And then, what parts of our SFM system and what is the scope of our vulnerability assessment going to be? What are we looking at here in terms of the land base, in terms of what parts of our system are we going to analyze? And with Mystic, they decided we're going to do the whole FMA, and we're going to look at our entire SFM system here. So from there, we one of the things through this phase that we wanted to reiterate to everyone is that understanding the context for your vulnerability assessment is one of the most important steps in this process. And it's a step that we always revisit even when we move on to a new phase in this process. It's kind of our foundational piece, we think, and it gives us our direction. As it's outlined also in the CCFM guidebook, when you really describe the context of your vulnerability assessment well, then that ensures that the goals or outcomes are aligned with your SFM system, and also have a preliminary understanding in your mind of how you might utilize this information, this vulnerability assessment near the end and within your system. So at the beginning in phase two, the guidebook recommends that you have outcomes. And the outcomes that we looked at for this process were, we wanted to have a real clear understanding of the reasons for undertaking this assessment, and then a clear picture of our SFM system that we're assessing. We also thought it was really important to have a list of partners, potential partners, other stakeholders, researchers, etc., that would be involved or that we could draw on their expertise throughout this process. And then again, we went back and we confirmed that we were all on the same page in terms of the scope and direction of the assessment. So this phase that I've been discussing the last couple of slides, phase two, it's very, very important. It's not a phase to be rushed through. We spent a lot of time really giving a lot of thought to where we wanted to end up when we, as we move through this. And an important thing to keep in mind is a central question of, first of all, through this SFM vulnerability assessment, can the objectives that we have within our system be met with our current policies under the current climate? And then looking at our potential future climate scenarios, could our SFM objectives be met under those, given future climate? So that's something we continue to revisit throughout this whole process. Another piece of this and getting started for us anyways was we felt that it was really important to build a team. And we developed a terms of reference and a work plan right at the very beginning so that we understood who was involved at what stages of this process and who is responsible for each of the tasks that we were going to be moving through in here. So what were our roles and responsibilities? And another thing that we came up with in the beginning was a plan for communication, because especially with Mystic, communications is a huge part of their SFM system. And we wanted to come up with a plan for how we were going to involve different stakeholders and interest groups, etc. And how were we going to disseminate the information about this whole assessment process, our progress, and what kind of results we were coming up with. So that's one of the big things that we think has been really important in this process. So when you're in phase 2, this is you're gathering information, you're really looking into what your SFM system is and current climate, etc. So part of phase 2 involves an analysis and collection of information regarding climate, regarding the physical pieces of your SFM area of interest, and looking at what kind of future climate scenarios you're going to be basing your assessment on, and forest scenarios. So and you're also identifying where you have some knowledge gaps and things that you're really uncertain of. So for Mystic, when we were looking at future climate and future climate scenarios and forest scenarios, what we did was we focused on using what is set out by the IPCC, and we decided that we were going to use 3 different time horizons for scenarios. So we have the current climate, and then we're looking to 2010 to 2039 for our first future time horizon, and then we're looking at 2040 to 2069 for our second one, and then for our third one we're looking at 2070 to 2099. And we decided that we would use the RCP, the Representative Concentration Pathway projections for climate under the most severe that the IPCC has come out with of 8.5, because we thought if we are looking at this vulnerability assessment under the most severe and developing adaptation options and that under those scenarios, we can always downscale if things aren't that bad. But we thought this would, from our perspective, would better prepare us, if we looked at what we thought as a team would be sort of worst case scenario type of condition. So when we really started to get into collecting and analyzing climate data, at first, it can be overwhelming because, from Mystic's perspective, they don't have people who specialize in climate scenarios and modeling on staff. So you think, oh, we're going to have to invest a lot of money and hire people to do this. But when we started to get into this part, Mystic realized that they already had a lot of the data analysis and research relating to climatic impact for past, present, future that they had done for their SFM system. So we utilized that information in this part of the assessment and found that many tools, data required were there. So we were just building on and utilizing it in this manner in terms of the vulnerability assessment. And at this point, there was a recognition that of making more connections between climate change and their SFM system. So that was a really exciting thing, sort of starting to shift in the way that they were thinking about certain things that were happening within their system and their SFM objective and planning. So then after phase 2, we moved into the detailed vulnerability analysis. And to be honest with you, this is this phase, it's a lot of work. We really got into it, and it could, if you don't take a step back and kind of break it down, it can be a little bit overwhelming. But you break it down step by step, and you really come out with some exciting results, is what we found. So in this stage, we looked at the current and future impacts on SFM, and looks like I lost connection here.
Oh, you still look like you're on there, Sheri.
Oh, I'm on there? Okay, it came on to mine that I had, sorry. Okay, so in this stage, we looked at evaluating the adaptive capacity of the system, and then what is our current and future vulnerability looking like? And so this is a ranking system, and there are tables that are provided within the guidebook to allow you to put your SFM objective and look at your current climate and how you're ranking your vulnerability in terms of high, medium, and low. And then you can put in your future time horizon, so those 3 that I discussed, and based on whatever scenario you're using in terms of, for temperature, like we use the R 8.5. And it allows you to rank it. And what we found going through this process was that there is the company itself, they have a really sound, knowledge base of their FMA, of their system. And to have somebody from an outside come in and do this for them, they wouldn't have gotten the same result. Because when we really started to go through it, they were making those connections and making those linkages to help better understand their system themselves, I guess, from a vulnerability aspect with relation to climate change. So this was a very exciting process, and as we moved forward with it, you move into a decision phase, okay, at the end of phase 3. So after you've completed this detailed vulnerability assessment, it's telling you, okay, this is what you're ranking your adaptive capacity at, and do you require adaptation? Do you want to move forward from here? And what Mystic decided was that yes, we do have vulnerabilities on our land base. Some of them we're experiencing now. We are most definitely going to be experiencing them to different degrees in the future. So we want to move forward to identify adaptation options and then come up with ways of how we're going to mainstream these into our SFM system at both an operational and a planning scale. So our next steps now, we're moving into phase 4, and we're looking at implementing and monitoring adaptation. So we're looking at evaluating like what potential adaptation options could we have for the SFM system, and what are our options overall, and then how do we look at mainstreaming these? How are we going to prioritize these adaptation options? How are we going to monitor and implement them? And out of that, we so far have come with some really important takeaways, we feel, for any group that's going to look at doing this and starting this process. So from our perspective, we feel that, having company employee ownership and engagement in this process from the beginning to the end is very important. They need to be part of it. And who knows their system better than the people that are doing it? Continually keeping the original problem or challenge of the SFM system of interest in mind at each stage of the vulnerability assessment, and then looking at adapting phases to fit your SFM system. One of the things, like throughout this whole process, like using the guidebook, you have to remember it's a guide. Okay, you can adapt it as you go through it for however it will best suit your system. And we've done that through the process. And that's been a really exciting thing because it's allowed us to get started and then to expand on it. Another thing that we felt was really important is that to get across, I guess, to people who are going to do this, that you're not reinventing the wheel. We have found that a lot of tools and foundations are there within our current SFM system to build on and to do this. And so a lot of the way that we're going to be implementing monitoring and mainstreaming this, it's going to become just an additional portion of Mystic's SFM system. So it's not trying to build a whole new way of monitoring or a whole new piece of management. It's just going to become part of the current way that they do business. And as I mentioned before, like breaking things down as you go through this process so you don't get overwhelmed. And I guess one of the main things we've come to realize at the stage that we're at is that the vulnerability assessment isn't the end. We are finding now this is just a starting point, and it's going to enable us to be better prepared for the future. It's opened up a lot of good communication in that with the government and in terms of the policy piece of it, and it's going to help assist in mainstreaming adaptation for the future and into the planning and operation. So those are things that we feel are really important to keep in mind if you're looking at starting this or you're already into this. Some of the tools, I mentioned tools that Mystic already has, and some of their tools that they have on this that are helping them with this is their certification process. Through their CSA certification, they have to follow the criterion and indicators set out by the CCFM, and also their VOITs. And VOITs are their values, objectives, indicators, and targets that they have set up. And their VOITs are something that are required by the provincial government. And the VOITs are linked to their 20-year forest management plan and also to their annual report and annual operating plan. So through these VOITs, we are putting in just another column that's going to include a climate change piece. So that's going to be connected to all parts of their SFM system, and it's also going to be connected with what they report on to the provincial government. So that's a huge thing, and it's already there. It's going to fit in really nicely with mainstreaming this. We're also looking at developing some standard operating procedures that deal specifically with climate change. And I mentioned the annual report. And yeah, we're putting this incorporating it into the 20-year management plan with a focus on where our priorities and vulnerabilities are currently, where we think that they're going to go in the future. And of course, this will always be revisited, and we'll be reevaluating where the priorities are, and it'll change through over time. So in conclusion, we think that this is important. It's critical for long-term planning, and it's also mandated by the Saskatchewan government. So that helps, move forward with the directive from the government as well. And we know that the climate change is impacting so many parts of our forests, and they are going to have implications for sustainable forest management, for achieving the goals and objectives in the future. And the results and tools provided from this research will help policymakers and practitioners better understand and adapt for an uncertain climatic future, and hopefully manage the boreal forest here in a more proactive way. So just to end off here, I'd like to also mention a lot of the collaborators on this project. And Dr. Colin LaRock at the University of Saskatchewan is my advisor for this research. And I work out of his Mad Lab in agriculture at the university. Mystic Forest Company and Meadow Lake Tribal Council, huge supporters of this. Saskatchewan Research Council and Dr. Mark Johnson, who is also part of the committee. And Ministry of Environment Forest Services branch, Dr. Rory McIntosh. He is our liaison for this project, and he is also part of the PhD committee. And the John Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Jeremy Rayner there is very well versed in international forest policy, and he's also part of the PhD committee for this project. And Canadian Forest Service, well, many members there have been very supportive of this project. But Jason Edwards has been involved from day one and is an excellent resource, and was a big part of the development of the guidebook that we're utilizing for this vulnerability assessment. And we've received funding through NSERC, and also the government of Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment and the Assistant Deputy Minister have helped financially to fund this project. And a special thanks to the Mad Lab field crew and University of Saskatchewan Forest Soil, or the Department of Soil Science, Dr. Ken Van Rees, who specializes in forest soils, and Ken is part of the committee as well. He also has a long-standing research relationship with Mystic and is very well versed in their landscape and things that we're dealing with there. So I thank you for being for listening today, and I will pass things over to Annette.
Great. Thanks, Sheri. Thanks so much. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions. So again, if anybody would like to ask a question via the chat box, please feel free to go ahead and type out your question. If you're on the conference call line with us and would prefer to ask a question over the phone, all you're going to have to do is hit *6, and that will unmute your line, and I'll come and see if there are any questions on the conference call line after we take some questions in the chat box. So Sheri, we have some questions there. So the first one is from Finn. Did you consider First Nations as potential partners or stakeholders in phase 2?
Okay. Well, first of all, I guess to give a better idea of Mystic. Mystic actually is a First Nation company, per se. Like their sort of their overarching body is Meadow Lake Tribal Council. So Mystic has a number of advisory boards and people employed and involved from different First Nations communities within their forest management agreement, and they are very involved in this process that we're doing and the Operation Mystic's SFM system. So yes, they are they have been part of it, and they are part of this throughout phase 2. And yeah, that's been really exciting because Mystic has a lot of other things that besides forest operations that are going on in their FMA, and that is very important to them. They really consider the non-timber values, for example, like the trapping and the rice harvesting, the berry picking, those things. So we have had a lot of First Nations involvement.
Perfect, thanks. So there's a second question there from Finn. So Mystic already had an SFM system. So hypothetically, if there was not one existing, would you set it up differently? And if so, what would you include that's not normally a part of an SFM system?
Good question. Hypothetically, I don't know. I think, Finn, I'd have to give that some more thought. I mean, the focus for this right now, and knowing the CCFM framework and the guidebook, it is really tailored for groups that have some type of an SFM system, and it doesn't have to be like within industry. I think how I would do it is I would look at, I guess, what are the goals and objectives of the group looking at doing this, and then from the goals and objectives, I would see how I could sort of tailor that and fit it into adapting the guidebook, sort of the phases that you go through, to see if I could complete that with, you could look at, instead of an SFM system, I guess you could look at your management objectives, right? And what your mandate is. So you could tailor it that way. Just speaking off my head at this point.
No worries, all good. Okay, thanks, Sheri. So there's another question here from Nelda Craig. So what was the time frame for steps 1 through 3?
Okay, well, steps 1 through 3. We started the steps officially at the end of July 2016, and we completed phase 1 and phase 2. So we started that in July, and we finished those phases in December of 2016, and moved right in from December 2016 to the middle of March, like about a week and a half ago. We worked on phase 3. But keep in mind that's been basically my sole purpose in the PhD process so far. So I have been, focusing on that as a primary thing. If you don't have somebody who's focusing on that on a really regular basis, I guess it depends on how much time can be allocated on a weekly or a monthly basis for your system.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sheri. So Antoine has a question here. So in terms of monetary investment on the part of the firm, what are your estimate costs to undertake this whole management process? And do you think the firms would benefit from working this all out through external expertise, or should it train its own employees?
Well, okay. In terms of monetary investment on the part of the firm, my estimates, cost, wages, time. I can't give you a clear answer on that at this point. I'd have to put a little more time and thought into that one. But I mean, I'm not current on what actual wages and that are within a company. I guess it all depends to who you've got working on it and that. So I mean, I could look into it and get back to you somehow on that piece of it after I talk more with the company. But in terms of, do I think the firm would benefit from working this all out through an external experience or train its own employees? Well, I guess I'm an external person who is helping Mystic facilitate this. I'm helping guide them through it. I'm not doing it for them. I'm working with them because for us from this perspective, for the success of it, has been that Mystic has to buy into it, that they have to take ownership and be engaged over it. My recommendation is that people, the employees, the company, they're the best ones to do this. And I don't think, from how we've found it so far, it's actually not, if you set it up the correct way with, you know, a team of people that are working on it, who's responsible for what. I think once you get into it, you would find that it's, you know, you can do it internally, and that there are resources out there like Jason Edwards from CFS that you can contact for guidance and advice as you go through the process. So I think, you know, there are ways to train the employees and that's not going to cost a lot of money to be able to really get in and do this vulnerability assessment.
Perfect. Thanks, Sheri. And speaking of Jason Edwards, I believe they have some questions over the conference call line. Jason?
Yeah, it's John Dornbos from CFS, along with Tim Williams and Ray Darwin. Jason is not with us. We're just using his name.
Ah, perfect.
So there are a couple questions. My question was, I heard the earlier discussion about First Nations, and I wasn't sure I heard it all, the answer, because we had some discussion going on here. But I'm just wondering about how were traditional value or Indigenous values, traditional knowledge incorporated into sort of setting the context and setting up the objectives, developing the objectives. Like, was that done using existing information, or was it a specific part of the process?
You mean in the beginning, like when we were looking at the context, like look what our outcomes, what we wanted to get out of this process?
Yep.
Well, I guess with working with Mystic, it's unique because in their mandate and their outcomes in their SFM system, First Nations values and input is part of it. That's something that they have right in there. So right from the first stages of this, it was already part of how they do their operation. So
okay, so there's no incremental work done then. It was just using what Mystic through NorthSAS was already doing in their SFM process.
And discussing actually at the public advisory group where a lot of these where a lot of the First Nations on their FMA are represented, discussing it with them as well to find out, you know, if they felt like we were including what we needed to include it, and if we were heading in a direction that they were comfortable with.
Okay.
Hi, Sheri. It's Tim Williamson here in Edmonton. I just wanted to say it was a great presentation, and congratulations on taking what is a fairly kind of a conceptual and, as you said, can be overwhelming approach and putting it into a real world context. I think that's a real advancement, and so congratulations on doing that.
Thank
so
you.
You mentioned a couple of things that were sort of interest to me. One is the whole question about knowledge and uncertainty, and that kind of leads down, I guess, sort of a couple different paths. And working with the CFS, I think one thing that would be of interest to us is, you know, what comes out of your analysis in terms of areas where we need to work on the science. So, like, where are the most significant science gaps in terms of, you know, providing even a better understanding of vulnerabilities. And then the second part is the question of uncertainty and whether or not there was any findings relative to how Mystic is managing risk for things that you just can't even answer with science. So there's going to be those kinds of impacts also. So there's sort of a two-part, you know, what are the biggest science gaps that came out of your analysis? And was there a specific discussion about how to better manage risks?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion and still actually going on. One of the things that we sort of came up with at our last meeting when we were finishing off phase 3 and looking at, okay, are we moving forward from here? What's, you know, where are we at? One of the things that we're actually doing up is a list of knowledge gaps, and came up with the idea of sending it to different agencies that could help us with these things, looking towards the future in terms of impacts on the boreal forest. And something that was continually brought up was making connections between, like, extreme climate, like the weather variability, and the operations on the ground.
Okay.
Looking at doing more applied research, like taking that and actually applying it. They were talking a lot about these back and forth extremes that are causing problems with access. So how do they deal with these extremes in, you know, warming and cooling for the temperature, and access, and trying to do winter harvest and site access, and how do they try to account for these? Is there a way that more science can be done to aid them in coming up with adaptation options for this? This is discussion that's come out of these things, and trying to figure out ways to do it. Another one is really struggling with how to salvage these extreme blowdown, the wind event and the blowdown, and for salvage operations and that, and maybe, you know, looking at alternative uses for that wood and doing more research into that. That's something that they've been talking about.
Great.
So there's a whole list, and I definitely can share that with you, but those are some of the key ones that they've been discussing from an industry perspective.
Great. Thanks, Sheri.
Oh, you're welcome. What was the second part of that?
Well, it was about sort of related. I think, you know, sort of the idea of managing the risks, for example, street fire or insect outbreaks, or, you know, is there something they're thinking on an adaptation, from an adaptation perspective, that they might do differently to manage higher perceived risks?
Well, we're just we're moving into that piece now with
Okay.
coming up with the adaptation option. And what we're doing is we actually, in that last phase with when we were looking at assessing the vulnerability for the SFM objective, we decided to include our main core indicators in that as well. So we've taken it to the indicators level, and based on those indicators under, current and then the future scenarios, where are we seeing, increased risk? And then we're highlighting those areas and looking at, okay, what are potential adaptation options here? And on some of them, like in our preliminary work at this stage, we're putting, need more understanding, more research on this. And so we're hoping that, those will help, for the future to give sort of better direction of maybe where to focus some research on.
For sure. Sounds good. Thanks, Sheri.
You're welcome.
All right, thanks for the questions. We don't have any more questions on the chat, but maybe do we have one last question on the conference call line? If there are any, please go right ahead. If not, Sheri, is it okay if people email you with additional questions? Are you okay with that? If they have any.
Oh yeah, that's great, definitely. And just, there's so much that we have already that, I couldn't even go into today. So if people have more detailed questions, I'd be happy to try to, answer them as best I could.
Perfect. So when I send out the post-webinar email, I'll CC you so that everyone has your email address. Okay, well, we're a little bit over time, so I guess we'll wrap things up. So thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. Sheri, a very, very big thank you to you for your time and effort and for a great and informative presentation and good discussion. Any last comments from you before we sign off here?
No, I thank you very much. This was a great experience. It was kind of bizarre sitting here. I feel like I'm talking to myself, but I appreciate everybody for joining us today. It's great.
Great. Well, it was our pleasure. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. That's it for us today. Enjoy your week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sheri.